Hey, it's Drybear. I am finishing up my last endgame Necromancer build in preparation for Season 1, with pre-season fully explored on Necromancer. At this point, I have put in over 350 hours for just Necromancer alone, in past tests and in the live launch over the last month. I've also made over a dozen endgame viable builds and have made a point of exploring every single mechanic inside the Necromancer kit to make sure that everything shines the way that it should. So today, with Season 1 just around the corner, I wanted to do a full class review of Necromancer, all of my thoughts and opinions on the class itself, strengths, weaknesses, builds, viability, and everything in between. So that's what we're going to get into today. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. If you don't come hang out with me in the community, in the next few minutes, your eye is going to start itching. All right, let's get into the review. Just like with my minion testing, rather than going through and trying to find specific visual gameplay examples of all of these, I'm just going to have this as a simple report going over all the findings, so that this video can be done within a a day's worth of work rather than several weeks trying to find all the footage individually and make that work. I'll make this document available in the comments and down below in the description if you want to read it or use it for reference. And of course, you can find me on Twitch or on YouTube under Drybear or Drybear Gamer. Of course, we have to start with disclaimers, otherwise there's going to be a lot of extra comments of just people throwing things back and forth. This is a game design review and also a player perspective combined into one. And keep in mind, this is just one man's opinion. This is my perspective on the class after putting a significant amount of time into it and exploring every possible corner of Necromancer in general. But you're welcome to add your thoughts in the comments or come chat with me on Twitch on how you view Necromancer. And for clarifying, this review is from the viewpoint of the current state of the game in preseason or Season 0, without assuming that the broader game issues will be handled separately. There's plenty of broad game issues around build diversity, crowd control availability and avoidance, resistance scaling into higher tiers, so on and so forth. All of these things I think are not just Necromancer problems. So this is not just with reworks or future changes in mind. This is just the current state of the game and how I think Necromancer stacks up. Now, we will be getting into a lot of very specific issues and shortcomings for Necromancer, but I do want to make it clear that the overall feeling for Necromancer is excellent. I think they hit the classic Necro Lord of the Undead vibe really well. The VFX looks great. The feedback is really strong. The audio effects are very strong. And I think a lot of the decisions you're making as a Necromancer tend to fit the Necromancer theme really well. So I think that while it does have clear holes in its kit, the vibe is really strong. It's a lot of fun to play. There's great offerings for it. And none of the issues that Necromancer faces right now are enough to detract from the overall experience from Necromancer. And none of them feel so fundamental that they can't be fixed with future updates or new content. So I think right now, Necromancer is in generally a good spot, but there's definitely a lot to talk about on how to make it better. Let's start with the strengths. One of the biggest strengths for Necromancer is something that it has that no one else in the game has, and that is the concept of Blood Mist. Blood Mist is easily one of the strongest utility options in the entire game. Not many things in the game come close to how powerful this effect is. And I think it makes Necromancer stand out in that way. It offers small amounts of healing and fortify. It grants immunity, which is very hard to find in general for Diablo characters across the board. And it allows movement while you're immune, which those two things together is one of the best things that you can get in a game like this. It also synergizes heavily with delayed damage and damage over time, in which the Necromancer has in spades. There's a lot of deployable effects, damage over time effects. Things like Corpse Tendril have a build-up time and a firing time. So having something like Blood Mist, I think, is a perfect addition to the toolkit offering that Necromancer has, because a lot of what they do is slow, limited, or delayed. They have excellent enemy management and crowd control, better than most characters in the game. Bone Prison is one of the most powerful and flexible mobbing tools in Diablo 4. You can use it to pull enemy attention away from yourself. Even if enemies are programmed to chase player characters down, you can trap them, remove their pathing, and force them to attack the walls of Bone Prison. You can block doorways, you can create the gates of Thermopylae and channel enemies into different spots. You can redirect bosses, you can change mechanics with the Bone Prison. Having deployable collision is very, very cool and very strong in general. On top of that, Corpse Tendrils and adding the Void aspect to the Shadow core ability, Blight, are incredibly strong grouping tools, some of the best in the game. And so while Necromancer is slow, yes, they have some of the best ways to handle enemies and position more than any other class in the game right now. They also have amazing cooldown management. Decrepify is insanely powerful as a curse and allows fast cooldown resetting that enables many playstyles. I think in the future, as they look to make adjustments to Decrepify, if they look to make adjustments to Decrepify, they want to be careful not to kind of devalue or break some of the flow that it allows in the Necromancer kit by reducing some of the cooldowns that make the gameplay feel a lot more fluid. It also has a wide set of viable playstyles. I know, yes, I know that everyone out there is going to be saying that you either need to do, explosive mist resetting, or you need to do some variation of Bone Spear. But I would say those people have not done the level of exploration or have applied the level of creativity to the class that I have been kind of working on. And I would say that Necromancer generally has a very wide set of viable playstyles. Yes, Corpse Tendrils, Blood Mist, and Decrepify show up in most builds, but unlike some of the classes in the game, there's all schools of magic, all ways to play the character can be viable if you know how to set up the build and implement it. With strengths come weaknesses, obviously. Mobility is a clear shortcoming for Necromancer. Easily one of the slowest, if not the slowest class in the entire game. And even with Reaper's Pursuit, which gives you movement speed when dealing shadow damage, plus bonus movement speed on both boots and amulet, and things, like legendary aspects on your boots that allow you to move faster, Necromancer remains one of the slowest moving classes in the game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as it is backed up with ways to circumvent that or to bolster that in some way. Typically, if you have a very slow character, you generally will give them a very high variety or options for avoiding crowd control, avoiding taking damage. Like tank characters tend to be very good at this. However, I would say that if Necromancer is going to be one of the slower classes in the game, they shouldn't also have a very low availability in unstoppable effects and cleansing crowd control. Those two things combined together become problematic. Individually on their own aren't that problematic. I mean, if you have a high mobility character that has lower unstoppable, then you can position around things, you can avoid things, but being extremely slow and also only having one unstoppable option in the form of Blood Mist, which is also pretty slow, kind of compounds that problem to make it feel rather irritating in general. Yes, they have the class agnostic options of getting the eluding aspect, which is a conditional based on being CC'd and near death, and also the Band-Aid solution of activating curative elixirs, which cleanse crowd control but do not apply unstoppable in combat. Outside of these two solutions, Blood Mist is the only option for Necromancer, and there's a high amount of crowd control in the endgame for Diablo 4. The other weakness for Necromancer is that vulnerable applications are limited. They're primarily only available to Bone builds, which is another reason why Bone is the best school of magic currently for Necromancer. Bone Splinters, Bone Spear, Sever, Bone Prison, and Corpse Tendrils are the only options for Necromancer to directly apply vulnerable themselves. And you can see that of those 5 offerings, 3 of them are in the Bone School. Sever is every 4th hit and does require a large amount of essence to apply. And then Corpse Tendrils, of course, is one of the most useful and heavily utilized abilities in the entire kit. This heavy skewing towards Bone helps solidify that the Bone School of Magic as the dominant option, because Bone Splinters can apply vulnerable very easily. Bone Spear can apply it on first hit, and with legendary aspects, can apply it to anyone after the first hit. So Bone Spear kind of becomes this multi-use tool that can apply vulnerable and do bunches of damage all in one thing, which kind of makes it, another reason why it's one of the best options. You can apply vulnerable with Cold Mages to targets that are frozen, and with Iron Golem. However, in the current state of the game, they are both rather unreliable, mainly because minions get stuck. The Iron Golem has to path to the location in order to activate the active ability to apply vulnerable, which means that timing the vulnerable application from Cold Mages or Iron Golem with anything you're trying to utilize is extremely unreliable and unrealistic, because you can activate the Iron Golem active ability, and he could use it right away, or you could use it 6 seconds from now, depending on what he gets stuck on, where he paths, what he's currently doing, where he is, or if he's even alive. And so you have this range of like, if you press the button anywhere from now to like 6 seconds from now, Iron Golem will apply vulnerable, and that just does not feel good for applying vulnerable and trying to get your damage out inside of that window. And also, cold mages can only apply vulnerable to targets that can be frozen or will be frozen. So when you have resistances there, it gets kind of weird. Also, Shadow and Blood are limited in build choices due to vulnerable options. Vulnerable, if it's going to stay as the best scaler in the game, having no options or only one option for Shadow for those two builds means that Shadow and Blood builds are forced to pick up Bone Prison, Corpse Tendrils, or a Bone Builder or a Bone Spender just for the effect of applying vulnerable, which every build needs in the game right now, and they don't have any options for that. Sever is the only option for Shadow, but again, you have to cast it 4 times to get vulnerable out of it, which means that you can't work it in as a part of the mix. It needs to be a primary utilization. You need to be spamming Sever in order to get any reliable vulnerable out of it, or you need to use Bone Prison, Corpse Tendrils, or Bone Splinters, Bone Spear. Shadow and Blood builds are forced to use Bone abilities or Corpse Tendrils just to get the vulnerable option, which is required for meaningful damage. Missing components for Necromancer. There's a couple things that I think that they could benefit. We've already touched on a few of them. Necromancer feels like it needs just one more option for applying vulnerable, either as a generic tool or as a part of the Blood School, which currently has no ways to apply vulnerable. I think this could be a passive effect like Barbarians have. This could be an active effect. It could even be a legendary if you really wanted it to, but it feels like part of the restriction around build diversity for Necromancer revolves around its lack of availability for vulnerable in general. Generally, someone has to be the slowest moving class, right? If you're in a race, someone's going to come in last. Everyone can't tie. Everyone can't get a participation ribbon. So it makes sense and seems fitting that it would be Necromancer that is the slowest moving class, because they have tons of utility. They can summon armies in front of them to stand in front of them and be their shield and things like that. So, I'm actually perfectly fine with Necro being the slowest class in the game. And I would think that most Necromancer players would agree with that. However, typically, the slowest moving classes tend to have the highest amount of avoidance for crowd control and avoiding damage, whereas it feels like Necromancer is the slowest moving class in the game, but does not have the highest availability for those, or just simply does not have enough. So Necromancer as designed, I think should have 1 to 2 more options for gaining Unstoppable and or breaking out of crowd control that has already been applied, that isn't just Blood Mist, and that will help them, like if they're going to stay slow and more, strategic commander playstyle, then I think that having more options there will allow them to do that while still maintaining that slow-moving playstyle. Blood Mist fits the slow utilitarian paradigm, as it makes sense that you would want to have windows of immunity if you can't escape very easily, but its existence makes it nearly required for almost all builds and difficult content. So if there was just one more option for the same survivability purpose and CC immunity purpose, it would help open up the playstyle options for Necro. Additionally, it needs to be said that Shielding Storm, the legendary aspect for Bone Storm that builds up a shield on you, is a one-of-a-kind effect and currently has no Necromancer-themed competition, which means that many builds that want to be survivable but aren't Bone-themed are going Bone Storm, Shielding Storm for the sheer fact that it allows them to survive. And if we could add in a Blood, Shadow, and or a minion survivability tool that accomplishes what Shielding Storm does, it would make the Necro feel a lot more flexible. Things like based on number of minions, you get shielding or defenses or damage reduction, or you get Fortify for extra blood or things like that. Being able to survive better in the same way that Shielding Storm does. I think we're seeing Bone Storm, Shielding Storm show up in most endgame builds that aren't even any way related to Bone, just because this one aspect has no competition. When it comes to build diversity, despite what you may hear on the internet, I do believe that Necro has one of the strongest offerings for build diversity in Diablo 4. I've played all of the classes. I've done tons of theory crafting on every class in the game. I'm well aware of what diversity there is, and I would say that Necromancer has one of the best options and availabilities for build diversity compared to any other class in the game. However, There are two core issues that face build diversity for Necromancer. The first one is pretty obvious, and we've touched on it a little bit already, which is certain abilities provide necessary effects that make them nearly compulsory or required for all builds. These are primarily Blood Mist, Decrepify, and Corpse Tendrils, and because of this, they make their way into nearly any build that you see for Necromancer. And ways to fix this would be if you could add another survival or avoidance tool like Blood Mist. It would help free up that slot to be something besides Blood Mist. Another cooldown management tool would loosen up Decrepify. Decrepify does have a chance to stun, which works great in some builds. It also has a damage reduction in a slow, which works great in most builds, but the primary reason Decrepify exists in most Necromancer builds is because it has a lucky hit chance to lower cooldowns. If you could find another way to do this, then you wouldn't need to use Decrepify for this. It feels like most Necromancer builds that use an ultimate ability have to also run Decrepify in order for it to be viable and competitive. A new reliable source of vulnerable or another self-buff like Grasping Veins would loosen up Corpse Tendrils as well. I think primarily most builds run Corpse Tendrils a little bit for the grouping aspect, though there are other ways to do this. But primarily because it is a very easy, reliable source of vulnerable that is not tied to the build, and because it has a very powerful self-buff with the aspect of Grasping Veins, giving you crit damage and crit chance. And the second thing that limits the diversity for Necromancer is that blood and overpower builds have an upper limit. I think just in general, you can make very strong blood and overpower builds, and they work pretty well up to about Nightmare 80, Nightmare 90, but pushing into Uber Lilith or pushing through to Nightmare 100, the damage kind of caps out. It almost hits like this ceiling of how much overpower damage you can stack and how high your HP can actually get, whereas most other builds that are pure DPS focused have a lot more runaway scaling, right? They can just scale out of control, get bigger, 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 whereas blood and overpower kind of have this soft cap ceiling where they hit and they stop scaling as much because there's a limit on how much of those. It's a little bit more linear rather than exponential growth that the DPS builds tend to have. Getting into each individual school of magic, let's first talk about Bone. I think that Bone is slightly bloated in what it has in its offering, but it feels like the most complete of all the Necro offerings. And I think that as a school of magic or play style for Necromancer, if we could get more of the other styles to be closer in line into the options available inside of them, like Bone, I think it would feel really good. Bone Splinters, Bone Spear, Bone Prison, Bone Spirit, and Bone Storm all feel mechanically dense and have rewarding usages and nice legendary options. And I think a big contributing factor to Bone being the most powerful option right now for Necromancer is that Bone Splinters, Bone Spear, and Bone Prison are all reliable ways to apply Vulnerable, the most powerful scaler in Diablo 4. Whereas if you look at other options, Minion, Shadow, or Blood, Blood has no blood unique ways to apply Vulnerable. Shadow only has Sever, and then Minions have Cold Mages and Iron Golem, which, as we've discussed, are reliable and hard to utilize in difficult situations. So most of these other builds have to spec into Bone in order to get Vulnerable or use Corpse Tendrils, whereas Bone kind of has that in spades in general. And adding on to this, the splintering aspect, which gives Bone Spear additional Vulnerable after the first target and bonus damage on the return, means that it is a fundamental pillar in Bone Spear being the #1 option for Necromancer, causing Bone Spear to not only do insane damage on the way out, insane damage on the way back, but also apply AoE Vulnerable repeatedly while spamming it, far better than Sever or any of the other options there. And this makes Bone Spear kind of a one-stop shop. It spends your essence, it can generate essence, it can deal damage, it can apply Vulnerable, it can do bonus damage, it has AoE damage, it has single target damage. It just has so much going on that, unlike other builds for Necromancer where there's more setup required and more steps, it just kind of does everything in one button, which makes it easily one of the best options for Necromancer. Talking about blood skills, I actually had a lot of doubts around the overpower mechanic working upon launch, but after lots of testing and pushing it to its limits, I'd call it a success as a separate. We don't see this implemented very often, and most times when a tertiary or secondary mechanic is added like Overpower, which is like a way to deal damage that isn't directly dealing damage. You're building tankiness to deal damage, which is a new way to play. Typically, those things end up going poorly in that, you know, they just get kind of slid under and combined with other DPS options, and it doesn't force people to play that way and create a new playstyle. They put a lot of restrictions around how Overpower works, how it's triggered, how you access it, almost to the point being slightly too much, but I think it does work and it fits that, and it creates brand new builds that feel very different, which is really, really cool. Unfortunately, it does feel a bit undertuned as a general mechanic and tends to kind of peter out at the highest level of builds, but it's new, it's fresh, it feels good, and I think it was a great addition to the ARPG kind of playstyle. In general, I think Blood is immensely satisfying. The visual and audio feedback feel great. The way it looks and the way it implements and the way it plays, super cool, and with a little bit of buffs, I think it could be really, really, one of the best options for Necromancer. Another issue with Blood is that non-overpower variants like Supernatural Blood Surge, which makes it deal more damage when you're fortified, and Paranormal Blood Lance, which makes it have higher attack speed and lower cost when you hit a target that's when you have 2 targets Blood Lanced or a boss that's Blood Lanced. Both these options feel lackluster for what they do, and they don't seem to compete with either the overpower options for Blood or the normal core ability spending options for Shadow and for Bone. If you play Blood Surge Blood Lance like their Bone Spear or like their Bone Spear or Sever, it's just going to not scale very well and it doesn't feel very good. So while it's nice to have the secondary options that aren't overpower focused, feels like those could be brought up pretty well. The main gripe that I have with Blood Wave, the Blood Ultimate, is that the placement of the 3 Blood Orbs that get spawned from the last upgrade option, Supreme Blood Wave, is typically very awkward and out of reach. I know a lot of people hate on Blood Wave. It's actually very strong. If they spent time playing with it, they would understand how good it actually is, especially in Blood builds and Shadow builds. But in general, the Blood Orb option is one of the reasons why you pick Blood Wave, and the fact that the Supreme Blood Wave spawns the Blood Orbs, sometimes all 3 of them at the very end of the Blood Wave, which is way away from where you spawned it. Sometimes it spawns on the other side of a pillar, sometimes it spawns behind a door or on the other side of a wall, and it generally feels like the logic for spawning those Blood Orbs that you would pick Supreme Blood Wave for in the first place just feels very hard to use because the way they spawn is awkward and kind of buggy. But in general, I think Blood is a great playstyle option. You only need a few buffs and some new mechanics added to the game, and it feels like a really, really cool way to play, and I do really like it. It's one of my favorite playstyles for Necromancer. On to Shadow. I think Shadow is incredibly diverse and well-balanced. Not so much as the Bone, but it does have a lot of different ways to play, which is really cool. The burst damage offered from Sever and from the proc effect from Shadow Blight combine really nicely with the damage over time from Blight, Blighted Corpse Explosion, Ultimate Shadow aspect, and the passive from Shadow Blight's passive bonus. So these two together make a very fun and very cool Shadow offering. We've been able to make lots of Shadow builds work. I think there's plenty of ways to utilize all of the different things in the kit, and it just feels like a fun, interesting, cool option. I do wish that there was a pure Shadow ultimate that would go along with this. I understand everyone has 3 ultimates, but that's kind of just where we are. But in general, I think it's great, man. Like, you can turn Bone Storm Shadow, you can turn Blood Wave Shadow, and there's just a lot of really cool options for it. It does seem like offensive options for Sever and the burst of Shadow Blight's burst feel a bit limited and could benefit from maybe 1 or 2 more offensive legendary aspects. But in general, they are really fun and good to use. And another gripe that I have with Shadow is the size and the width of the Blight core skills firing projectile make it very awkward. It's tiny. It's almost like, it's like a Blood Lance size. Like, it's very little. For something that I would picture as a globule that's kind of creating this puddle, the size and width of that projectile is incredibly small. And if you're trying to land it anywhere outside of melee range, it becomes widely inconsistent and kind of annoying to use just because it'll pass by enemies very easily and deploy very inconsistently. So I feel like the Blight projectile could stand to be widened a little bit and made a little bit bigger so that you could actually more consistently hit without having to be pinpoint precise. And that would make that ability feel a lot better, in my opinion. The Blighted aspect also feels like a crutch for Shadow builds. This one is when you deal Shadow damage 10 times to a target that has the Shadow Blight passive on them, you get a large bonus of damage, and I feel like this aspect is kind of carrying shadow builds right now. It's in every single one of them, and for good reason. It's just very, very good. So it feels like this, more options would be nice. And on the other side of that coin, I feel like Aspect of the Damned, which gives you specifically shadow damage when you have both curses on a target, feels a little overly constrained and hard to use for how much it offers. I mean, Blighted Aspect can give 120% to 240% damage, not just shadow damage, but damage in general. Whereas Aspect of the Damned gives up to from 40 to 80% damage, only shadow damage, and only when you have two abilities on your bar that get used in conjunction. So it feels like those are a little bit out of touch. Additionally, I think the Gloom and Terror passives are a bit of a bait for players to make a Shadow Summoner build, even though only Shadow Mages can benefit from these effects. Gloom and Terror are the shadow passives that say that you can increase the shadow damage of your minions, plural, when you do shadow damage or damage with darkness skills. However, this only currently applies to Shadow Mages, which is a big bait. I've had a lot of people ask me. I've tried many times to make a viable Shadow build for endgame content, and every time it feels very lackluster because speccing all the way into Shadow when you're only benefiting Shadow Mages feels like a bit of an awkward spot. And if there was a Shadow option for Skeletal Warriors, say Skeletal Reapers did shadow damage, or if you could modify your Golem to do shadow damage as well, that would make the Shadow Summoner or Shadow plus Minion hybrid playstyle a lot more interesting as an option, because then it would be applying to the whole kit, not just you and one very specific type of minion. Speaking of minions, let's dive into this. Minions have plenty of things going on, and there's been a lot of discussions online on how to improve these, and I'm sure there's been even more discussions internally on how to make these better. But let's go through my thoughts on preseason Necromancer with minions. The first and most important thing, the thing that I would like to see them fix before they go into like massive buffs or reworks, is just firstly the pathing, collision, and lack of hustle that the minions have. Minions would benefit massively from improvements to their reliability. They often get stuck on each other. The Golem will get blocked by the Skeletal Warriors. They'll get stuck in doorways. They'll stand behind pillars and stare at the wall like they're on timeout. And they'll do that for like 10 seconds straight. They will stand still, not attacking. They'll go AFK. They'll log out and they'll just be standing there. And I feel like if minions are going to be this way, they either need to be massively stronger or they need to be a lot more reliable, right? Because, Frozen Orb doesn't go AFK, Bone Spear doesn't get stuck on things, right? Like, you just don't have these situations happening with other sources of damage. So them happening constantly with minions is a bit of a problem. Low minion movement speed also means that in a dynamic encounter, they have inconsistent uptime in attacking. If they're running back and forth, having to change targets, getting knocked back, if they get CC'd, if they get stuck on something, them having little to no hustle and getting to their target and starting to do their damage makes them even harder to utilize properly in good situations. The second one is a very important one, which is area of effect damage. Typically in other games, RPG games and things that have minions and deployables, it's very common and kind of expected to have extremely high damage reduction for deployables and minions when it comes to AoE or area of effect damage sources, so that they don't die to them. Because in general, minions and deployables almost always will stand in bad things in deployables and fields and AoEs and explosions, and you can't really control that they do that, so it sucks to have them die to AoE, and typically you'd see a high damage reduction to area of effect for this to help circumvent that problem and make it better. This low resistance to AoE means that minions often, even with Hardened Bones, Cult Leader, the Dead Razor Glyph, all of the armor they can possibly get, all of the damage reduction they can possibly get, giving them Blood Orbs through Transfusion, giving them Skeletal Priest fully maxed out, giving 60% maximum HP, constantly using Raised Skeleton to heal them as much as you possibly can, they will still often die to deployable fields like Poison Enchanted, Plaguebringer, Shock Lance, Electrified Obelisk, Fire Enchanted, or Frozen, all of which are AoE effects that you can't stop them from standing in, which severely limits their ability to scale into difficult content. There are some affixes that avoid this, like for example, Stone Friend, which is the Stormbane's Wrath, the rock that slams. does no damage to minions. And I think this was a good insight. It was a good predictive limitation to make it so that that AoE damage doesn't murder your minions on the regular. And I feel like this kind of paradigm and thinking should be applied to more, if not all, AoE damage in the game, so that minions don't run into a fire enchanted on Nightmare 100 and then just pass away at the sight of it, even though you have every possible defensive option in place for them. Next, talking about the Golem active ability. The biggest problem with the Golem active ability currently is the fact that after you activate the ability, the Golem needs to physically path to the location you've asked it to go and use its active ability at. And yes, it does get unstoppable when you activate this ability, and it does get a little bit of a movement speed bonus. However, it's still limited by pathing and navigation. If it can't find a nav path to get to where it's going, you will sometimes either have the Golem never use the active ability. You'll activate it. It doesn't know how to get there. It's blocked by an enemy, a minion, a friendly minion. It's blocked by a bone prison. It can't get there. So it never uses the ability. You press the button, it goes on cooldown, nothing happens. Or it just takes a really long time to get there. So you might use the active ability, and then 4 or 5 seconds later, he goes, and then when there's no enemies in the area, he's all alone in a room, he uses his taunt or his heal, blood heal, or his slam stun with vulnerable, and there's nothing there, and you just look at him like he's the most awkward person in the room because he just didn't do anything. It means if something is blocking the path, even from the minions, it'll take a long time to get there and will often miss the opportunity that he has. I think it would be a massive improvement to the Golem if the Golem simply just teleported to the location instantly or nearly instantly and used the effect right away. I know it kind of like, you know, it breaks that the suspension of disbelief, because why would the Golem just randomly teleport? But I think that being able to be relied upon as an active ability for the Golem, I think trumps the presentation and the lore of the Golem having to walk there, because there's too many issues with it. Obviously, you wouldn't want the Golem to be teleported to spots that they can get stuck in outside of the world, outside of collision. There's bugs in QA you would have to do to make that work right. But I think the goal probably should be making the Golem just instantly appear there and instantly use the ability so that it can be a reliable part of the Necromancer toolkit. Next is idle time. There's a lot of time where minions just get stuck. And then they just kind of give up on life. Like they go AFK and they go get a drink and they wait for all of it. They go to the pub and wait for all this to blow over, basically. If they can't find a navigation path to their target location, they will too often just stand there and go idle. I've had many minions just go up to a pillar and put their face up to it and then just go on timeout. And they don't do anything for 15 seconds straight. You don't know what they're doing. They're not applying any value. Like I said, spells don't do this. Minions probably should have more logic in there that helps them get unstuck more aggressively and with more hustle. Effects like daze, so like Drifting Shade, which is a common affix in Nightmare dungeons, also cause minions to go idle, which feels very weird. So if a minion ever gets affected by the daze effect, not only do they stop attacking, but they also stop pathing. The daze effect, the crowd control effect daze, it's almost like an EMP for a robot. The minions just turn off. Like they get unplugged and they stand there and do nothing. They don't move, they don't path, they don't think, they just wait for the days to end and then they start moving again. Which makes Drifting Shade super annoying for minion builds, because if they get stuck in it, they just stand there. Even if you walk away, they're still stuck like standing there in shock until the daze goes away. Then they wake up and start moving again. I feel like them not being able to attack inside the daze makes sense, but them stopping their pathing inside the daze doesn't, and it feels really, really weird as an effect. Next is curses, and I think the biggest problem with curses is just around player feedback. Visibility and tracking for curse applications is, in my opinion, rather weak, and it forces the player to keep track of curse timings in their head. Curses last for 10 seconds. I have learned to count to 10 in my head so that I know when the curses are there, because outside of having the VFX around the enemy's feet showing slow, there isn't really a very good way, if not no way, to know if an enemy is cursed or not. And because you have things like amplified damage, you also, if you're running Aspect of the Damned, where you get your damage bonus if the target is affected by both curses, there's all these things that rely on the target being cursed, but there's not really much visibility around them being cursed. And so you kind of have to just run this, like, you know, tell Alexa to run a timer so that when when the timer's up, you have to recurse, or you just kind of recurse early because you don't know how much time is left. I totally get the desire to limit visual clutter, and I do believe that this is why curses are done with such a light touch as they are right now, because it could very easily create insane clutter on the screen. This happens in other Diablo games and other ARPGs, but I think it may have been pushed a little too far of the edge, and it's the point where I think the curse feedback is just not good enough for what they do. Even if it's just an icon or a UI element or even just a buff on your bar, it would make it, it would go a long way for Necromancers being able to tell if a target is cursed or not. And lastly, Iron Maiden feels like it's missing something. If it is to be a damage source, the damage it provides currently, even after the massive buff that it got, is negligible. It's almost not even part of the equation, the amount of damage that it does, which means that the only reason you'd pick Iron Maiden are for either the essence generation that it gives or the healing return on, which is like a life on kill for maximum HP. And these two reasons, and then also the aspect of the damned, are like the only reasons to get Iron Maiden, whereas every build requires Decrepify, and it feels like that's just not a very good paradigm. And yeah, I mean, there exists many options to gain essence outside of Iron Maiden that don't require a skill slot through ring aspects or other bonuses. And you can get healing in other ways as well, which makes Iron Maiden feel like kind of a unattractive option to pick up for curses. Talking about passives, I actually, when I went down to write my notes here, I didn't really have a whole lot to say. I think there's a great offering for passives in Necromancer. Hued Flesh feels good. You get ways to spawn corpses through Lucky Hit. You have close damage and damage reduction, distant damage, damage bonus to cursed targets. You can make your core skills stronger, which is really cool. You can make your darkness skills stronger, your bone skills stronger. You can reset the cooldown of your bone skills. You can make your blood skills stronger. You can make them apply more fortify, more healing. You can grant some of that healing to your minions. You can get bonuses to your minions in every tree down along the way. You can make your minions stronger, healing them, giving bonuses there. You can make you stronger for not having minions. And the key passives seem to fit all of the different playstyles that you have for Necro. The only thought that I would have there is that it does seem like there's plenty of room for additional key passives to expand the Necromancer kit. Many other classes have like 2 choices per school or multiple options that fit, whereas Necromancer kind of only has 1 per playstyle. And I think that adding more would definitely feel pretty good for Necro. Diving into legendary aspects. These are my thoughts on the ones here. For the most part, most of them are really good. I think there's enough flexibility and variety in there. And I'm very excited to see how the Malignant Hearts play into this, and also how many legendaries and uniques Necromancer gets in Season 1. But in general, these are my thoughts on the current offerings for legendary aspects on Necromancer. The first is that Viscous, which gives you 2 to 3 additional skeletal mages, and Bloodgetters aspects. Bloodgetters gives you 2 to 3 if it's on Amulet. Skeletal Warriors, them being separate makes gearing for minion builds feel too expensive in general. Defensive and utility legendary slots are very limited, even though Necromancers do have the option of running a shield, which means they can get another defensive or utility slot that other classes wouldn't be able to get access to. Those slots are still limited, considering that Boots usually has mobility that you want to put on there. Defensive options have to be on legs and chests. You don't really have much choice there, considering how dangerous endgame content actually is. And so having to run both Viscous and Bloodgetters as a utility option for minion builds just feels like it's way too much. And I feel like in the current state, as it sounds right now, to make a build viable for Necromancer, it's almost impossible to make one minion. Like, you can't do a skeletal mage minion build. You can't do a skeletal warrior minion build. And it's even harder to do a golem focused minion build. The way that the cult leader build works, all of the hulking bonuses work, and all of the minion builds work, generally if you get one type of minion, you are heavily encouraged to get all types of minions, which means that there's not really any viable paths to running just Viscous or just Bloodgetters, which means that I think that either those 2 legendary aspects should just be combined into one and let that just kind of be what it is, or you kind of individually buff them and place them into a different category. So maybe Bloodgetters is a utility legendary that gives 2 or 3 skeletal warriors, and then maybe Viscous gives more mages and causes them to do more damage, and it becomes an offensive legendary, as an example. Hardened Bones, which is the legendary that gives you damage reduction for your minions if you have 7 or more, feels like it's way too small of a bonus for the conditions required. You basically only apply it to your minions, and only if you have 7 or more, which means you need all types of minions. You can't do, I mean, you could do warriors and golem and still get the bonus, but in general, you need all types of minions to get this bonus, and it only goes up to 20% on normal slots or 30% on amulet, which feels like it's way too small, considering things like unyielding commander can go from 90% to 180% damage reduction, and even then minions still die to things like fire enchanted in the current state of the game. Now, obviously, if there is a global damage reduction buff for minions, Hardened Bones becomes a little bit more viable, but Hardened Bones right now feels like it's such a waste of a slot because it's not going to make your minions survive. It's such a small number competitively and just is overall kind of weak. Bursting Bones, which makes your Bone Prison deal damage, flat damage bonus when they expire or get destroyed, is too small. I think the number is very, very tiny for what it does. It does almost no damage and is typically only used for its chance to trigger a lucky hit. In most cases, if you're running Bursting Bones, you're not doing it because it does damage. You're doing it because it gives you more lucky hit chance. And so I feel like if it's going to be here as that option, either they keep the lucky hit chance as it is, or they look to increase that damage and make it a little bit more viable. Frenzy Dead also appears to have some bugs in maintaining its effects in extended combat. This is the one where as your minions attack, they stack up attack speed. I'm not sure exactly what the bugs are. It's hard to tell, but you know, in boss encounters where you have long duration fights against like bosses, this buff will just disappear and never reapply. I don't know if it has to do with the Necromancer breaking combat if they don't attack often enough, or if the minions break combat, or something is going on there. I don't know exactly what it is. I'm not a QA tester. I'm not being paid for this. So I just want to be aware that that is happening, and it's worth investigating. Additionally, Shielding Storm needs more competition for what it does as a defensive aspect. We already talked about this, but in general, it's kind of like the only option for this as a survival, and I think it's forcing people to do Bone Storm in builds where they normally wouldn't, just for Shielding Storm because it's that good. Aspect of the Dam also seems like too small of a bonus for how specific it is, requiring 2 equipped abilities in Iron Maiden and Decrepify, and also only providing bonus damage in one type, and that is shadow damage, whereas others don't require the same limitations, and even then, when they do, they provide more damage bonus that's a little bit more widely usable in that case. Sacrificial itself could use a slight buff. I think Sacrificial is an awesome bonus. It's very attractive and interesting. You can get vulnerable damage, crit chance, crit damage, attack speed, max HP. It's a grab bag of really good, useful stats. But I feel like even when you put it on a two-hander or an amulet, the bonus that you get from it is so small that it's not really as interesting of an option and probably could use a slight buff. Talking about uniques, I think all of the Necromancer uniques in general are pretty good except for one exception, and that is Bloodless Scream. I think Bloodless Scream is the biggest new player bait in the entire world. It sounds good, it has cool synergies, it makes sense in your head, but it is one of the easiest ways to completely brick your Necromancer and make them do no damage. The main issue with Bloodless Scream, which is a two-handed scythe that makes your darkness skills apply chill. If you deal damage to a frozen target, which means they have to build up full chill and freeze, you get essence back. The main issue with Bloodless Scream is that it is a two-handed weapon that provides little to no offensive bonuses whatsoever. Even the stats on the weapon are little to no offensive bonuses. This makes the Necromancer lose out on a main hand and an offhand, losing significant amounts of potential damage for their kit, only to gain crowd control and essence generation, which is typically something you see for rings or for armor or through skill builds in Paragon, not from a weapon. So the fact that it's a two-handed weapon that only gives CC and essence generation makes it a very hard item to use. Now, that being said, if Necromancers had an effect similar to like Sorcerer's Shatter, where you can make frozen targets explode and deal damage, this would make Bloodless Scream a more interesting option, but as it stands right now, Bloodless Scream being a two-handed weapon that gives no damage makes it a very, very bad option, and it's something that needs to be looked at if you want Bloodless Scream to be useful. Otherwise, all other uniques feel useful and interesting. There are some that are better than others. That's always going to be the case, and that's kind of where I rest my point on that. Also, Necromancer would benefit from having a unique option for the offhand slot, which it currently doesn't, either a focus or a shield, and I think that could really make the build's variety feel really unique. Next, let's talk about the Paragon boards. There's a couple gripes that I have about Paragon boards and things that I think could be improved in future updates for Necromancer. Firstly is in the Bloodbath and Blood Begets blood Paragon boards, the pathing between the corners of the board and between the legendary nodes and the glyph nodes feels overly distant, very restricted, and difficult to reach. That's because they basically have two paths on the opposite sides of the board, whereas most boards have like 3 to 4 different ways to reach the different corners, which means that if you want to get the glyph and the legendary node or anything on both sides of the board, or bloodbath and blood baguettes, you have to take this really long extended path around the board to get to the other side, whereas most other boards don't have this problem, and it makes bloodbath and blood baguettes be exceptionally expensive for what they provide. Hulking Monstrosity's glyph area also has 1 less stat availability for glyph scaling than any other board. I don't know why. Most boards are between 26 and 27 viable stat options in order to scale glyphs. Hulking Monstrosity only has 25 for some reason, and it's not even like the best in any of those categories for intelligence, dexterity, or willpower. It's not the best in any of the categories, and overall has less. It just seems like it could use another couple points for intelligence, dex, or willpower, or all 3 in order to make that board a little more interesting for them. Additionally, Bone Graft would be more interesting if it had an additional node cluster that wasn't directly tied to bone. Almost the entire board of Bone Graft is tied directly to bone skills, except for 1 cluster on it, which gives max essence, which pretty much only affects bone builds, and then essence on kill. Essence on kill is really the only reason you would ever go into Bone Graft outside of getting dexterity. So it's actually one of the best. It's tied for best for maximum amount of dexterity available inside of the glyph range, tied with Bloodbath. So you would go into it for that. But otherwise, you almost never go into Bone Graft outside of bone builds. And I feel like most other boards have damage reduction or max health or crit damage or attack speed or something that gives you a reason to kind of, vacation through that board to get extra benefits and makes the building interesting, whereas Bone Graft kind of doesn't have that benefit. You basically just avoid Bone Graft unless you're trying to slot a dexterity glyph or you're running a bone build. Additionally, for glyphs, I think there's 2 glyphs that could stand to be a little bit better for Necromancer. They just kind of have weird, awkward interactions. The first one is Corporeal, which is a general glyph that scales physical damage and physical damage reduction modifiers in range. But there's almost no nodes in the Necromancer Paragon boards that benefit from this. It pretty much only reacts to the nodes that have armor because that's physical damage reduction. But there's not really that many glyphs spots in the Paragon board for Necromancer that will give you physical damage scaling or other physical damage reduction modifiers, which feels like a little bit of a miss. The Mage glyph that makes your Skeletal Mages better, the increased passive of 25% to Skeletal Mage resistances is it just feels undertuned when you consider the World Tier 4's resistance global penalty. 25% magic resistance is it's kind of silly. It's like trying to wear a paper hat when you're in the middle of a nuclear explosion. It's not going to do anything. It doesn't do anything for the mages. They still die to magic damage. I've tried it with mage, without mage. It doesn't make a difference. That passive is completely negligible. And I feel like that number should either be a lot higher or they should just get like magical damage reduction straight instead of resistances, just because it's so heavily nerfed. And lastly, there's a couple bugs and nitpicks that I would have around the class, things that I think that if they were fixed sooner rather than later, it would be better for the feel and gameplay of Necromancer. The first one, is one that drives me absolutely up the wall. When you run the Ossuous Gale offensive legendary, which makes Bone Storm consume corpses in order to extend its duration, the corpses that get consumed by Ossuous Gale don't get garbage collected right away. If you blow a corpse up or you spawn a minion, the corpse is gone just like that. If Ossuous Gale consumes the corpse mesh will stay behind for like 5 to 10 seconds. Even though it's not a game object, you can't interact with it, you can't cast corpse skills on it. So if you're running Bone Storm with Ossuous Gale and you run around, you're going to have this field of corpses, and like 90% of them aren't real, so you can't cast on any of them. So it makes it really weird for you to go and like try and use corpse skills with Ossuous Gale because you're not sure which corpse is real and which one isn't. Ring of the Mandel, also very well-known bug. It does not trigger inside enemy suppressor effects, which is really annoying. I think Suppressor in general just has a lot of bugs with it that could stand to be improved. But Ring of Mendel not proccing makes that build feel really bad with Suppressor, and that one should be fixed sooner than later. And the last nitpick that I have for Necromancer is that the grouping logic for Bone Prison should be adjusted for the Necromancer or the player specifically. What I mean by this is that Bone Prison has logic in place that when you place it on the ground, since it is creating collision instantly on enemies and players and people that could be standing in the area, it has logic to either push them to one or the other side of the collision that's being spawned. For enemies, it seems to want to suck the enemies into the center of the Bone Prison if it can, rather than force them outside of it. However, it seems that this logic is also applying to the Necromancer. So too often, I put the Bone Prison down, and even though I feel like I'm a mile away from the Bone Prison, I end up inside of it. I put it down in front of me with just the enemies, and I'm on the outside, and then when it spawns, it vacuums me into the Bone Prison with the enemies I'm trying to stay away from. And I feel like the logic should be corrected for the Necromancer specifically, so that it tends to put the Necromancer outside of the Bone Prison, or lessens that amount of vortex that it has to make it feel better, so that they just don't end up inside of it. And I also think, I don't have this listed here, but in general, I really wish that if you're not in a PvP zone, that Bone Prison wouldn't have collision blocking for allied players. I actually really feel bad putting down Bone Prison on the ground, and then having it trap my teammates or random people in the open world. And I feel like I'm socially obligated to bring my Bone Prison down, even though I'm using it for some kind of effect, like, Plunging Darkness, or using it for vulnerable. I feel like I have to take it down because I've now trapped some unsuspecting friend inside of it, and I am now trapping them inside. And I feel like in general, there should be some logic to allow allied players to travel over the Bone Prison so that they don't get trapped inside of it, so that it doesn't have that social aspect to it. And that's my review of Necromancer. After hundreds of hours played, I tried to cover as many of the biggest issues challenging Necromancer right now, the ideas of the kit as well, and just kind of my feelings and thoughts after having fully explored every aspect of its gameplay and offerings for how it's played and implemented in the game. If you found value in the video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people. And if you have any questions or comments, you can pop by my live stream. I'll be happy to chat with you there. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.